Item 6.06 is an information item. As a result of new law, the composition of the Board of Education will change beginning December 3rd, 2018. The board will now move towards being comprised of 7 nonpartisan elected members, 1 member from each of the 7 councilmanic districts in Anne Arundel County, and 1 student member. The first 4 elected board members will take office on December 3rd, 2018, and the remaining 3 elected members will take office on December 7th, 2020. In light of these changes, the board will engage in discussion on 2 policies for possible revision in the future. Policies BBD and BF. And Mr. Reinhardt.
Thank you, Madam President. As chair of the Board Policy Committee, we're having this discussion to remain in compliance with the Maryland Open Meetings Act, since we are discussing potential changes and concerns of policy. So we're having this discussion tonight because in our Policy Committee meeting, which is also open to the public, public's welcome to attend those. That calendar is published online. We began to have a challenge in figuring out when the best time would be for officer elections, considering we have what's going to be a mixed board of appointed and elected, and that folks have been brought on at different times, whether it makes more sense to have elections immediately after a board is seated, or if it makes more sense to match it up with our school calendar to start it on, say, July 1st. So we're having this discussion in public about what would be the pros and cons for those 2 situations.
Ms. Korbelak.
I would just say that our board has always elected our officers immediately upon seating in July. We always have turnover in July. And if the turnover is now going to occur in December, certainly by December of 2020, we'll have the cycle, in place. I think at some point there needs to be a transition year where you're electing your officers in July, say like July of 2019, next July, but those people serve for 18 months to get us to December of 2020, when you'll be on this new cycle of elected board members. Or you could do it the same thing, July of 2020, you elect your officers for 18 months, and by December of 2021, your new board has been here for a year, they know the deal, they can decide if they want to serve as officers. I don't think I don't have a preference either way. I won't be here, but I think we should align the officer elections with the seating of the board.
Mr. Grannon.
I agree with the substance of what Ms. Korbelak was saying, but just another alternative then would be obviously to have an election early in 2019, and that would be a new board seated. And I'm not saying that's necessarily better than what Ms. Korbelak was suggesting, but in particular, given the policy behind the legislature's change in how board members are selected, there might be a little thumb on the scale in favor of doing that, because if you don't do it that way, you're basically having the election of officers by an entirely unelected board govern a board that is at least half elected. So I'm just throwing that out there. And then obviously the incumbent officers, to the extent that they're still on the board, could run for re-election, and that would be up to the full board to decide, which would be a mixture of both newly elected as well as kind of grandfathered in people like myself.
Ms. Nally.
I agree with Mrs. Korbelak and Mr. Grannon that those should be considered. I think it's important, as a former, I've been president and vice president, and when you serve on the board, I think a lot of people don't realize how much it takes to be a board officer. When I first came on the board in 2007, it took me a full year to really learn everything I needed to know. I didn't want to be a board officer. I wanted to learn and I wanted to know. And I think that whether they're elected, appointed, or whatever, when a board member comes in, they aren't immediately ready to be a board officer. They really do need that time. So I think it's important, however the policy is written, that bear in mind that we need to I think do that and have everyone have their opportunity to speak. But just bear in mind that board officers, it takes a lot of training to be an effective board officer.
Mr. Reinhardt.
So I hear two sets of concerns, and it's from what I've heard so far, it seems that we're leaning towards changing elections to after the seating of new members. I see, just sort of play devil's advocate here. So we have two situations that could arise. When we have a completely elected board, there's the potential that every single person is new, and we will have to elect leadership among all those folks who are potentially unaware of the processes behind the scenes here at AACPS. So I was thinking, okay, so we'll start in July, but if we have that election in July before the general election and they get ousted, then we're back in the same situation. Just as I was considering, well, perhaps because of how we set the budget and our capital improvements, and we set our goals for the superintendent, all of that happens early on in the school year, and perhaps it makes more sense to have leadership seated in July so they can see the whole year through. Well, then we run into that issue again. Well, general election comes, the folks get ousted. So how would the board feel about creating a sunset situation so that we look at two chunks for our two differently seated or elected boards? So we keep it in July until we are fully elected, at which time it transitions to after the board is seated after the general election.
Ms. Corbelette.
That's what I was suggesting by having an 18-month president and vice president, because your fully elected board is December of 2020. So December of 2020 is when you should have December elections. Because we've already elected our officers for a July to July term, going through July of 2019. We didn't change our policy in advance, so they stay till July of 2019. So July of 2019 is the first time we could actually put a new policy into effect.
So Mr. Grannon suggested that perhaps after this election that we have another vote. So we can't change the policy at this time. Our officers are our officers for the next 12 months. Is that correct?
So it's based on the current policy. So if you leave the policy as is, then your officers are your officers. I mean, ultimately, if you decide to revise your policy in some way, and I'm sorry, Jeanette Ortiz, Legislative and Policy Counsel for the record. So when you update your policy, once you revise it, then you would follow through. You indicated a sunset provision, or we could do a delayed effective date is another way of looking at it, in that even if you updated the policy now, it wouldn't take into effect until whatever date, the board decides on the voting of the officers.
Mr. Grannon.
Yeah, I guess the more I think about this, especially since we're, no matter what, going to end up in a system where the elections take place after the board members are seated. That's what's that's inevitable. The more I think about that, the more I think about the aura or the impression that's going to be given to the new board members as well as to the public if we try to hold that at bay as long as possible. That seems like really frighteningly undemocratic in the face of what the legislature is doing to say, well, we're going to hold off on that because we think that people who have been in office longer know better, and so we're going to make their tenures stickier. I think even after hearing this, I even more strongly feel that we should make the case that the election should occur right after this December, and then the people who have these positions can make their case to the new board, which will be half elected or almost half elected, and then whoever else is sticking around, and they can make their arguments as to why their experience on the job in that particular position is what's best for the board, and then the full board can vote on that. But to say, well, we know better, and we're going to hold this inevitable change. It's happening. We're going to hold that at bay, and then it doesn't matter to me who these people are. But obviously, the two officers that we have now are both candidates for the board, and should they not win their elections, we're saying, well, no, we still want these people to be officers of the board, even though they didn't win their elections. That's entirely undemocratic. So I don't know if you're planning to do this by consensus or not, but I would not support that. And in that event, I would like to vote on that.
We're actually not voting on anything tonight. This is just a discussion, and then it will be sent back to the policy committee to be drafted. So there's no vote tonight. This is just an open, transparent discussion before the public about different options. Mr. Reinhardt.
So to your point, Mr. Grannon, you'd mentioned in earlier comments that we should give the incumbents an opportunity to make their case, as well as the new board members. I believe that could occur in January or in July, that they would both have that same, and the 6 months would give folks an experience. I certainly hear your concerns, and with going back to the policy committee, there will be opportunities for public comment, just as with all of our other policies, as we enjoy the discussion about sunscreen use in just a few minutes. So there will be an opportunity to hear from the public and also to cast a vote and share on that. But it's, if I understand correct, Ms. Korbelak, so we would, the second, so you were proposing 18 months rather than a 12-month and a 6-month. What's the rationale for 18 versus a potential 6 months?
I was trying to get us to December of 2020 because I thought it was too late to change our officers for the year. So I thought the election from July of 2018 was going to carry us to July of 2019, no matter what. And so we could have an election in July of 2019 for 6 months, but there isn't another election until December of 2020. So the new folks from December of 2018 will have been there 6 months, and they can certainly run for officers or elect the ones that they prefer. But then the next crop of new folks doesn't show up till December of 2020.
Okay. And for clarity, Mr. Gillen and Ms. Hummer, if you were to lose the election, would you still be members of the board?
Yes, we would.
Through the appointed seat?
Through 2020, yes.
And Mr. Gillen as well?
Yes. Yes. He would still be on the board until 2020.
Okay, so there still would be continuity in leadership across that next 12. Okay.
Right. So, Mr. Grant.
Yeah, I think a very important point that Ms. Korbelak was making is you had thought that, but then Ms. Ortiz disabused you of that. So that's a very sort of important, not so subtle point that we should get across, is it very easily could be changed in this policy by this board to make the election, for example, in January, in which case we would just then have annual elections in January, right after the members are seated each December. So we would be completely on cycle. We wouldn't have to go to some 18-month officership to make it even longer. We would have an election in January, and then we would have another in January 2019, and we'd have another election in January of 2020. Then whoever comes on in December of 2020 is eligible to run in the next annual election of January 2021. So we'd
Well-
be totally on cycle.
Well, the elections would actually have to be held in December because members are seated in December. So if a whole new board is elected and is seated December 1, you have to elect officers immediately. You can't wait until January.
Well, that's under the existing policy. We could change that policy. It doesn't matter.
Well, there has to be someone presiding over the meeting. So that would have to take place. Mr. Butcher.
Brandon, I'm almost there with you. What I'm trying to make sure I understand is it only if an individual is elected as opposed to appointed that you're suggesting that they should have an ability to dictate who the leadership is?
No, my suggestion was that whatever the constitution of the board is at that time, those people should be making the determination. And the best way to do that would be to have, and whether it's in January or at the end of December, whatever it is, I don't know that I accede to what President Hummer was saying that it has to be then. But in any event, as soon as practicable after the seating of the members gives the opportunity to that board to make that decision. And all I was saying was, if the experience in the officer position is the most persuasive thing to the full board members, then they'll vote on that basis.
So we have a vacancy right now currently. Let's just say that this is filled within the next couple of days for whatever reason. So we would have a new board member. Does that mean that we would then have to, under your suggestion, why not? You would have a new person that would then have to say, well, I didn't agree to the membership before. I should have an opportunity to weigh in on it. I could probably do the job better.
Because an ad hoc resignation or incapacitation of a board member that leads to a replacement is one person. What we're talking about is setting forward basically the constitution for how this board is going to elect its officers. And we're debating back and forth between proposals, and it was made abundantly clear through Mr. Reinhardt's questioning and I think accurate description that no matter what, we are going to get to a position where this board elects its leadership immediately after the board is seated. The only question is how soon we're going to get there. And what I was suggesting is it seems a little undemocratic to say, well, we know that's going to happen. That's going to be the way that this board elects its officers in 2038 and in 2058. But we want to hold that at bay a little bit longer so that our officers who have been in office longer, we think they know better, and we want to make their positions as sticky as possible. And I think in the face of what the legislature obviously is determined about making boards elected, that us rubbing against that is not the right thing to do.
Is there any, final question, is there any consideration on the fact that that's still in the middle of the school year? Is that any consideration? Whether it's December or January, it's still the middle of the school year. Is there any consideration to that at all, as opposed to having continuous leadership during the entire school year?
For me personally, as I'm talking about this, no, because I certainly think if we're saying that the election of the president of the board is going to be something that's going to be harmful to students in the middle of the school year to have that kind of change, I kind of hope that the students in our school.
Well, you're suggesting that the presumption is that it's harmful to students,
No,
but I believe I didn't say that. I just asked. I think there's other duties based off of the president and vice president in terms of what they're doing throughout the year.
Let me make it abundantly clear: is nothing I'm saying was meant to imply that, to be frank, whoever the president of this board is, that's going to be harmful to students. I certainly don't think that's the case from the current officers or any officers that I can imagine. What I'm saying is it's undemocratic for us as a public institution to say, we know it's coming, that we're going to have the election of officers immediately after the board members are seated. We're going to try to hold that off as soon as possible. That's what I'm talking about. Process and policy. I have no fear whatsoever that whatever decision we make on this, any students are going to be harmed.
Okay, you brought the harm part up. That's why I didn't understand that. So okay,
Well, maybe I misinterpreted your question. To whatever, when you were saying that there might be, then what were you saying when you're talking about middle of the school year? What difference does that make?
well, we've already started. That was the question. Was there any consideration at all in terms of any of these various policies of that these elections, everything that's taking place, whether it's December or January, it's going to be in the middle of the school year? That's the only. It's just an observation.
Not a consideration for me.
That's it.
Ms. Korbelak.
I was just going to say we can't guarantee the continuity of the president and vice president in election years because, as Mr. Reinhardt pointed out, the whole board could be wiped out in an election year, which is also why I would say December had to be the election instead of January by policy, because at some point there could be no one here in December who was already an officer from the previous year.
Mr. Reinhardt.
Ms. Urea, I'd like to apologize for an oversight. In fact, the student member would bridge. So we, as a fully, as a member with full voting rights on this board, yes, you could be. Perhaps that would solve our problem, Mr. Grannon. Is the student member could oversee for a few weeks until we get the new leadership. So go on the resume. So. Perhaps then we can come to a compromise. It seems that we are in agreement that we're going to go to, or that we're going to, in policy committee, we're going to propose for this board to vote on, that we will go to elections for officers of the board immediately upon seating, when we're fully elected. So I think we're in agreement on that. Mr. Gillen, you good? Yeah, all right. And so we're really limited now to the next set of months. Mr. Grannon suggests that we can start in January 19 or December 18, and we hear other members suggesting, well, let's do a longer stretch, or at least keep this leadership in place. And I'm not sure it's to make the position sticky as much it is just to offer continuity. I can see potentially that if we were to change leadership, whoever was in that leadership position, that they have the right to change the direction of the board. And if we've set our course for the school year, it is possible in the middle of the school year with new officers that we could change that course. And whether it's down to contracts or budgeting or whatnot. So, but that's going to be a problem once we're fully elected. So, what I'm offering then is perhaps a compromise, and we, rather than this next having another set of officer elections in December of 18, that we begin in December of 19. There was the expectation when this board voted that the officers would be in place for 12 months. We all voted with that understanding. Ms. Ortiz has since disabused us. That's a fun word. Has since disabused us of that. It's not fun. but how do we feel as a board, as mixed, appointed and elected, to start those elections then in December of 19? So we'd have a 12-month term with current officers, then a 6-month term, and then a 12-month term, 12 months after that. So we'd have a 12 and then a 6, and then we would begin the regular election process as far as we into the future we could see.
Mr. Granite.
I just, for the accuracy of the record, I want to make sure it's abundantly clear. Saying when I said January, I don't want there to be any semantics about this. I mean, as soon as possible after the selection of these members. And I guess I want to, reiterate, especially we're talking about different permutations here now with officers who are up for election, who are going to be, I guess, potentially even voting on this. And just the appearance of that. We could defer this decision. That's another thing we could do, is we could defer this decision until after the new board is fully seated in December. That to me, that would at least be a more respectful way to acknowledge the process that the legislature has put in place.
Yes.
Let me clarify. So
I'm still speaking.
Well, I want to address what you're saying because I think it will answer some of what you're saying. So the way that the timing on this would work, we're having this discussion now. It would go to the policy committee to be drafted. It would come before Ms. Ortiz, make sure that I'm saying this correctly. It would come before this board for the existing seated board for first reading and then go out to the public for public comment. Second and third reading, because of the timing, would fall under the newly elected board. So that way, this board has input into it, but the final vote and input and opportunities to amend, if they so wish, will go under the new board. So it would be voted on by the old board. This would not be the new board pushing something on with no input from the newly elected board.
Well, I disagree with that entirely, and I don't think what you just said was at all an appropriate clarification of the point that I was making. Because we would absolutely be setting in motion, but there's no reason not to do this in December after the new board is seated. Why set this in motion? Why make it that much harder for them to change something? There's no reason that this board has to do that. The new board could make this decision in December.
Mr. Reinhardt. Oh, sorry, Ms. Ortiz.
Add to Ms. Helmer's comment. So that is correct. So it would not be difficult for the new board to amend whatever this current board pushed forward as a proposed revisions to the policy, because they would have the opportunity to make any amendments on second and third reading. So it would go to the new board, which would be comprised of at least some new members on second and third reading, and you have the ability to amend a policy on second and third reading. So that would not be, that wouldn't be any different than the way we're doing it now.
Mr. Granite.
It would be entirely different to set in place something that a new board, it's then incumbent upon them to change something that's already in motion. There's no reason that it has to be done now. What is the pressing need that this has to be done at the end of September, set in motion now, that we have to do this when this decision could be made in December by a new board with people? It's like we're like reacting to this, that somehow elected board members are like an evil to be delayed as long as possible. The legislature put this in place. The people voted for the legislature. The people will be voting for these board members. It is absolutely undemocratic for us to put any impediment in their way for them to have a full influence on this. So there's no reason to have a first reading now. Let's defer this until December, and then that board can make the determination. And in particular, when we're dealing with a situation where officers are now potentially voting on their own continuity in officership when they're not even members of the board anymore, and financially benefit from having the officer positions, I think it just reeks of the idea that we want to do something to keep the elected board at bay, and it's not necessary.
Mr. Reinhardt.
Thank you, Madam President. If we're talking about timeline, the longer we push off this discussion, then the longer there is for the potential of a new board voting to hold, if they wish, immediate elections. So we're having this discussion now to give that option to the new board as soon as they deem appropriate to have that election. So if we push off for the first reading or even another discussion like this until December, then we're looking at March at the earliest?
Yes, because the policy, so if you wait until the new board is seated, and so for the first December meeting, not even the first December meeting, because it would have to go to the December Policy Committee, which is in about mid-December. So then let's say that Policy Committee, determines how they would like to revise this policy. The policy would not come before the full board with the proposed revisions until the second meeting in January, or the first meeting in January. It depends on how the calendar runs, but sometime in January. So then it would come before the full board in January. It would go on a 30-day public comment period, would take us into February, and then depending on where that falls on the calendar, it would be on second reading either in February or March. So we're not looking any earlier than March before then the new policy would be enacted.
So it is with respect to that timeline and the new board that we are having this discussion now to give the new board the option as early as possible to hold elections if they wish. We're trying to respect, with our proposal and with our timeline, the new board, including those elected members. So the insinuation that we are trying to hold off elected members from leadership. At no time will this board that is currently seated before you have a vote on this policy. We will never have a vote on this policy. I will never have a vote.
Thank you, Madam President. I've been silent on this because, to me, we'll figure it out when we get there. But, Mr. Grannon, I resent the implication that I'm sitting in this chair to financially benefit, because I am not. I get the exact same salary of $6,000 to do this that you get. And I know you're losing a boatload of money by serving on this board. I'm losing a boatload of money by serving on this board. And to sit here and say that I'm doing this because I have some sort of financial benefit is, to me, insulting. So with all due respect, I resent that, sir.
Mr. Grannon.
Okay. Well, with all due respect, I think I've known you for 8 years, and if that's the way you took that, then I don't think you know me very well at all. What I said was the impression that it gives the public to have people who are in officer positions voting on something that could affect their continuity in that position raises an aura of impropriety. It has nothing to do.
Mr. Grannon, we're not taking any vote.
Hold on. Now, the process point that you made, if what you're saying is correct, in terms of giving the new board an opportunity to vote on that, that's fine. I have no problem with that in terms of starting this now. But what you said was baking into the first reading of that policy this idea of a compromise that the next election would be in July of 2019. I do have a problem with that. If we're so eager to give the new board an opportunity to influence this as soon as possible, let's not blow on those dice. So I'm talking about the substance of what you're saying, not the process. If we're doing this to give the new board, immediate influence from the get-go, then don't bake into it this idea that the election should be in July of 2019, because that rubs against that.
Mr. Butcher.
I just wanted to clarify because I didn't think we were taking any vote. I also don't think that we need to have the type of tension for this. We're just trying to get it right. So I don't think it's really that big of a deal for us to start talking about people being undemocratic and all that other stuff. So let's just kind of keep everything above board.
Yes. I do want to bring in, I think, something that needs to be added to this policy, because there's currently nothing. The current policy states that if the president or vice president are temporarily unavailable to quit their above responsibilities, but there's nothing in there that says that talks about how, for instance, if a board officer resigns, there's no mechanism in there for how board officers would be replaced, and I think that needs to be added. I think the policy committee needs to look at that language and see what that would be if somebody resigns or, and steps away, how we would do elections at that point to fill an officer position.
So are we looking at, if the president were to resign, would we not have succession from vice president, or we would have to then vote for president and keep the vice president?
Well, there's nothing in the policy that says what we would do. It says if the president is not available, that the vice president steps in, but there's nothing to say that if a position becomes vacant. What if the vice president resigns? There's not an immediate person to fill their spot. So I think we need to add to the policy to have some sort of mechanism to fill possible vacancies at some point for how they would handle those things. So, Ms. Korbelak.
Ms. Ortiz, was there anything in the current law that said our officers have to be elected in July? Like, do we also need to go to the General Assembly to change that too?
No. School systems actually have that in state law. We do not. So we have discretion in determining that.
Mr. Grannon.
I think if we're going to be doing that, another thing that we can do, and it sounds like the policy committee is the right place to do this, is let's also examine the powers of the officers, especially as we're going to a fully elected board, and if there are concerns about people having those positions who perhaps don't have the same experience as the people who have them now. And inevitably, it's going to be the case that you could easily have a president and vice president who've had zero experience on the board. In particular, because of that, and because of the things that go along with having an elected board as opposed to an appointed board. For example, things like the president of the board being able to basically set the agenda for the public meetings if he or she so chooses without input from the other board members. That's something we should consider. This board put in place over my objection and over my vote something which seems really kind of silly and petty and arbitrary, that the president determines where people sit up on the dais. And at the time, I said, well, guys, we're going toward an elected system. Let's have people sit in order of seniority or alphabetically or something like that. And this board went, I think it was 8-1 against me, and said, no, the president should determine where people sit. And so stuff like that, we should really think about that kind of stuff as we're going toward an elected board.
Mr. Butcher.
Are you saying that this current board did that vote?
Yes. If you weren't here, then it was the board that existed right before you joined that. But that happened this year.
That is in the board handbook. It was revision of the board handbook, and it does say that the board president, with consultation from board members, sets the seating for the board members.
With consultation.
Are we really talking about where people sit? Is that what? Look, you talked about perception. We've spent more time talking about something that we're not even going to vote on that has absolutely nothing to do with the kids. That we've spent more time. We haven't even engaged with the people that are mentioning comments about lead in the water, but we're talking about where people sit and policy that we have nothing to do with. I'm asking that we just move on from this. This is really a waste of time. We're already sending stuff back for the policy committee to address. Let's keep it moving. This is kind of pathetic, actually.
Mr. Grannon.
Mr. Butcher, it was your election to comment or not about water safety issues. If you chose not to comment on it, that's your choice. What I'm talking about, this is a public body. It's a public function. And just for example, the Supreme Court of the United States has rules about where people sit. So what I'm talking about is not silly. And the idea that a single person could decide to move people around for some personal reason or a political one is a very serious thing that this board should take into account.
I take your point. We're just pretty much just like the Supreme Court. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any public comment on this item? Okay. All right. We will move on. Mr. Reinhardt, we'll bring that before the policy committee, which, as we said, is open to the public to attend, and we'll draft that, and that could come to us in the future.
There's certainly a lot to consider, and our next policy meeting will be Wednesday, October 17th at 1 p.m. here at Reba.
Item 2.08 is the policy committee update. Mr. Reinhardt.
Thank you, Madam President. Last week in our policy committee meeting, we had two policies that I did want to address here before the board. One was with regards to board elections. As we discussed openly, I believe it was 2 meetings ago, we discussed different election timelines that we could have. There were concerns both from the public and from this board that we were rushing this and that we were not giving the newly elected board the full opportunity to put in their input into the policy. So we decided as a committee to postpone further discussion on that policy until the board is elected, and that way they'll be able to chart their own course. The second policy that I wanted to address this evening was the transportation policy. So that policy specifies the basis for our busing of students and the regulations that the superintendent sets forth. There were two concerns that were the justification for bringing the transportation policy back in front of our committee. One was with regards to light rail. There was a concern brought up by the Linthicum community regarding light rail. We now currently have an appeal before the superintendent, and we anticipate that appeal coming before this board. So we opted to not investigate that further due to the likely appeal. And again, because of the timeline of the appeal, it is likely that the newly elected board will be addressing that, and we want to give them the opportunity to weigh in. In addition, we also had concerns about the distance that was set for busing of students. So currently elementary school students within 1 mile and middle and high school students within 1.5 miles are asked to be walkers over that distance, do get bus transportation except for a few special cases. Based on the research provided by our transportation office, decreasing the walking distance from 1 to 0.75 and from 1.5 down to 1.25 miles would be an increase in costs of transportation of approximately $2 million. The policy committee opted at this time to not change those walking distances. The $2 million can be put to better use with funding teachers for our classrooms and continue to reduce classroom size. So 30 teachers would make a big difference in the lives of our students. In addition, our distances were set at least 1972 based on our research back in 1972. And the current trend among districts in our area is actually to increase the walking distances in order to cut costs. So we're appear to be right in the middle of our neighbors. Prince George's has a 2-mile walk, so 1.5, and then some of our other neighboring districts are a little lower, but are investigating increasing that walking distance based on our research. So at this time, we did not make any changes to the transportation policy.
Thank you, Mr. Reinhardt. Item 2.04 is establish agenda order. Mr. Gilliland.
Thank you, Madam President. I understand we have students as part of the presentation for item 6.02, Global Community Citizenship course, on today's agenda. So that they can return to school as quickly as possible, I move that we take that item out of order and hear it after the CAC report this morning.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Is there any discussion on that? All right, Ms. Connolly, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Grannon.
Aye.
Ms. Corkadell.
Aye.
Ms. Urea.
Aye.
Mr. Gilliland.
Aye.
Ms. Antwine.
Aye.
Ms. Shawhan.
Aye.
Mr. Lyde.
Aye.
Ms. Ellis.
Aye.
Mrs. Hummer.
Aye.
8-0. 9-0.
So item
Motion
6,
passes.
item 6.02 is now moved to be after item 2.11 on the agenda. Okay, Ms. Schalheim.
Eric, would you like? I want to defer to Eric first.
I move to add item 5.00, election of board officers, to the top of the action items. The legislature and public have sent a powerful message about a new direction for the board, and there's no reason to delay an opportunity for that message to be reflected in the board's officers.
Okay,
Second.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any board questions or comments? Ms. Antwine?
Yeah, I have a question. Are you saying that we would do this today?
Yes.
Just as a clarification for board members, well, we'll get to that if it's added. Just a minute. I have a question for
Darren?
for board counsel. I'm sorry, just as a clarification.
For the record, Darren Burns, Board Counsel.
Okay, so when we are making a motion to add to the agenda, this is a time where we would discuss the actual motion, not the actual agenda item itself.
That's correct. The pending motion is, Mr. Granite's motion was to add an agenda item. I believe it was 5.00, and that is what the topic of discussion would be now that it's been seconded.
Okay, so it wouldn't be the merits of or of what's on there, just whether that's something that people want to add today to discuss.
I think there are, there's some range of what's appropriate, but the motion itself should be the focus of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. Ms. Schalheim.
Well, after we vote on that, I have another agenda item. Got it.
This is still this motion pending. We're still discussing on this motion. Is there
Perfect,
any
thank
other
you.
board questions or comments on this item? Ms. Ellis.
Yeah, I want to, I know I second, but I want to express that I'm in full agreement that now we have a board that 5 of us are new now. And so, and 4 of us were selected specifically as a voice of the voters. So I do think it's important that our voters have a voice in who's our leadership for this board. So I agree that we should do this.
Ms. Schalheim.
I also agree. Thank you.
Okay, is there any other board discussion or comment? Okay, Ms. Connolly, would you call the roll on to add item 5.0 board leadership elections?
Mr. Grannon.
Aye.
Ms. Corkadell.
Aye.
Ms. Urea.
Aye.
Mr. Gilliland.
Aye.
Ms. Antoine.
Aye.
Ms. Schalheim.
Aye.
Mr. Live.
Aye.
Ms. Ellis.
Aye.
And Ms. Hummer.
Aye.
9-0 motion passes.
Ms. Schalheim.
I would also like to move to add another item to today's agenda to go immediately following the election of board officers, moving all the other items on section 5 down just very slightly, and that is discussion of the Shadyside cell tower project.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Board, so any board questions or comments regarding adding the Shadyside cell tower? Ms. Urea.
So, Ms. Schalheim, you're saying it go right after 5.00?
Yes, that's correct. Thank
Okay.
you.
So is there any other board discussion on adding this amendment? Ms. Corkadell.
Messing up on the buttons here. Sorry. As a clarification, is it to open as a clarification to open up an actual discussion on the issues pertaining to Shadyside, or to add it to a future agenda?
Both. I want to discuss it today, and then I want to also add it to the next meeting's agenda as well, a nighttime meeting for the benefit of the residents, parents and teachers, and just community members of the community. Thank you.
Ms. Ellis.
I think, just to clarify, I think the benefit of a discussion today is because this board has in the past made it seem like this is an issue that is now closed for public discussion or any change on the position of this board. So this is just an opportunity to open that discussion to indicate that moving forward, we're looking to revisit this topic, correct?
Okay. For clarification, is the point to have to take an action today on this item, or at a future meeting?
Depending on where we go, it could be either, to be honest.
Ms. Antoine.
As a point of discussion, I think we should take an action on this today, because there are additional pressing issues as we move forward to include our upcoming budget, and we want to be able to know how we're moving forward on this specific issue.
Ms. Corkadell.
I just want to add, as a public record, that I think it's important. The issue is large in District 7, more so than other parts of the county, because it is my district school. And I would encourage us to forego any actual action in this, if that is its intent, so that all the residents, not just a few who may have found notice of it at last minute, to actually be prepared and to make sure that we are well prepared with all of the information. So I will request a clarification on that in the interest of transparency for my district residents.
Ms. Urea.
I would like to second what Ms. Corcadell said, just because I agree that it is a very pressing issue, and I think it's something that we should definitely discuss today, but I think taking any action on it would do a disservice to the constituents in that area, because it would be jumping the gun, essentially, on what is going down there. So, yes.
Ms. Schalheim.
I understand. I agree.
Ms. Antwine.
So for clarification, what is the motion today?
The motion is to discuss the Shadyside cell tower, to ask questions that need asking, and clarifications that points that need to be clarified, and then also to move to add that item as an action item for the December 19th meeting, which is a nighttime meeting, making it accessible for all involved to participate if they choose to.
That actually would be two different motions that would have. So the first one, I believe that one you have pending would be to add it today. I share the concerns with Ms. Corcadell and Ms. Urea about this being transparent and available, that any discussion we would have, that the community would be able to hear everything. That's why we publish things ahead of time. And so even a discussion today that would have, not all the community has been able to be notified to have this. I agree this is something that should be discussed and brought about with here. I think there's been some significant changes within the county government, but also in the county land acquisition about things in that part of the county that could open up some changes for this. And I would like to get some more information and answers. I'm also concerned that because there was not notice, that our staff may not be prepared to answer those questions as of this morning. So I would support the second amendment to put it on for the 19th, so that we could have all the information available to us from the staff viewpoint, and all of the community could be notified as well. That's my position on that. Mr. Grannon.
Madam President, I've got a point of order, just so that everyone understands. The addition of the Shadyside cell tower to the December 19th meeting does not require a motion, nor does it require 5 votes. Any 2 board members can support that. I can tell you right now, Ms. Schalheim, I support that, so consider it added to that agenda. But I also support your motion today to add it nonetheless as a discussion item.
And thank you for that point of order. That's exactly correct. We do not have to vote to add that. That would be a separate issue that's not included in the motion that's before us. But at that the request can be made to add that, and that does not require a vote as of today. Ms. Urea.
Just for clarification, Madam President, you're saying that you want it to just be added to December 19th and not discussed today, or discussed today and added as well?
I actually believe that for the sake of transparency, that it should not be discussed today, because this is a very sensitive issue that has come up a number of times before, and I think in all, as I said, transparency and fairness to the community, that the sufficient notice be given to everyone for it, but also for our own sake, that we can get the correct information here. I believe if we call up staff and we're having a discussion, they may not have all the information at their fingertips. We will get a better picture if everyone comes prepared with everything in place. We can direct Dr. Alato we can ask him to meet with his staff and have them prepare. We can also submit the questions, what we have, so that they can do the research and make sure all the information is available for us at the next meeting. Mr. Leib.
Yes, as I understand the motions, I would support adding the Shadyside subject to the agenda today. And I believe it is in the best order of business for the school system and the citizens for action on the item to be at a future date. If that be the 19th, so be it. But I would support that.
Ms. Corcadell.
I just want to also just mention and bring to the awareness of the members, part of our conversation stems out of concerns over transparency. And I think the public knowing what's on our agenda and what is going to be discussed, accepting emergency items as a consistency at the very least, needs to be considered in this conversation, because I want to make sure that we are 110% transparent, as I have committed to my residents, And adding this onto the agenda would not promote the transparency. I believe that my spirit and intent of of this body would incur.
Ms. Ellis.
I understand and agree with all of the concerns. Transparency is a very important issue for this board. My only concern is that this is an extremely time-sensitive issue, and there's work still ongoing to moving this project forward. So I just want to be assured that we're going to get the opportunity to address this on December 19th, and that this project will not have moved too far along for that to happen.
Ms. Schulheim.
In the 5 new members' defense, there was not an opportunity to add items to this agenda prior to this agenda being published. This is our opportunity to add items. If I had had the opportunity to add it before it was published, I would have done so, and I know I would have been seconded at that point.
And as a point of order, that is correct. This is an unusual circumstances that board members were just sworn in Monday so that they could not add items to the agenda before it was published, so it comes out. But that still does not negate that the whole purpose of publishing the agenda ahead of time is to provide transparency so that the public has an opportunity to arrange their schedules to come testify or to weigh in with written testimony ahead of time. And if it's just this morning, there's going to be a large portion of that community that is not going to know that any type of discussion would be happening on this item. Mr. Gilliland.
Thank you, Madam President. In the interest of one of the original motions to move and advance the global community citizenship course upwards so kids can get back into school, I'm hoping we can come to some quick consensus here. I would be interested, knowing full well that a decision or decisions will not be made today and would be made at a future time. It seems as though December 19th is that meeting. If this discussion gives us an opportunity even to get some questions on the record that staff may not necessarily have the answers to today but could come back on December 19th, for that reason I would support adding this specifically as a discussion item, even though it would be under the action items on the agenda, but specifically as a discussion item, I would support that.
Just as a point of order, since it could, if we were to do that, it would not be under as an action item. Action items would only be items that we would take a vote on. It would go under 6 under review items. And then it would be a point of discussion that would come out. Ms. Schulheim, would you be open to that, but to put it under the review items?
I would prefer that it be earlier. I'm looking out in the audience, and I see a fair number of residents from Shadyside, and so in the interest of their time as well, I would prefer it to still be under 5 point, moving things down. So that would be my preference.
Well, we can't, if we're not taking an action on it, it cannot be moved under action items. We could have the motion to move it up to review item, a review item early, before that, but it cannot be put under action items if we're not going to take a vote. Mr. Grannon.
I guess I just wanted to say that I like all you new board members because you kind of make me look like a conciliator, which is a new role for me. So I guess just want to make clear for the record so everybody knows there's not really any sacrifice of transparency in discussing this issue today because this meeting is obviously fully recorded. Anybody who wants to address the issue at the December 19th meeting can look at the recording of this meeting and have the benefit of any comments today. I think we could probably also thread the needle that the president has referred to and make it item 6.04, but then simply take it out of order and do it earlier, just like we did for Mr. Gilliland's motion.
So are you making a friendly amendment to
Sure.
make it at 6.04, but move it up to after item 4.08?
No, I would do it right after the whatever the item is coming after the CAC report. So it'll be the CAC report, then it'll be the student group that Mr. Gilliland referred to, and then it would be item 604, discussion of the Shadyside cell tower.
after, okay.
So in other words, it would live between 2.11 and public comment.
Okay.
Just like
Actually, it would be between 6.02 and public comment.
Correct.
So, okay. All right, so the motion is to put it as a review item, as item 6.04, after item 6.02, which is after item 2.10. Okay, Ms. Corkadell.
Since I've hit my button, it looks like there was a resolution of an amendment proposed that I would be willing to support as a review item. If we remove it from action item, I think we could still achieve the necessary transparency for the residents.
Are there any other questions or comments? All right, Ms. Connolly, call the roll, please.
Mr. Grannon?
Aye.
Ms. Corkadell?
Aye.
Ms. Urea?
Aye.
Mr. Gilliland? Ms. Antwine?
Aye.
Ms. Schallheim?
Aye.
Mr. Live?
Aye.
Ms. Ellis?
Aye.
Mrs. Hummer?
Aye.
9-0, motion passes.
Ms. Antwine.
Thank you, President Hummer. I would like to pose a motion as well to the action items. Since that one did not make the action item list, I would also like to make that action item after 5.00. I have a motion to have public monthly reports from the supervisors or department heads of the following public school areas: anti-bullying, diversity and inclusion, school safety and security, and transportation. I am offering this because I believe it builds on that consistency of transparency, and because we are newly elected officials, I must say those were the top items I believe helped me to get here today. Thank you.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, Ms. Antwine, could you repeat that again so I can get it all down?
Yes, ma'am. I even wrote it. I have a motion, please, to have public monthly reports from the following supervisors or department heads of our public school system in the following areas: anti-bullying, diversity and inclusion, school safety and security, transportation.
And just as a further clarification, so you want this to be an action item that the board would vote on?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
A yes or no vote, please.
Okay. Mr. Grannon.
Oh, my button's not lit. I was just going to second it.
Oh, okay. It's already seconded. Okay. Are there any board questions or comments on this item? I would say again, in the sake of transparency, I am hesitant to have an action item that would be a vote before something was put out to the public so that they would be able to come and comment on. It's not at all saying that I'm not for these things, but I think this is something that we could get some real feedback from the community on before this would go to an action item as to what the community may want to hear, and there may be other topics as well. I would suggest a friendly amendment that this be put on the December 19th as well, so that we could advertise it and really get public feedback on this topic, because I think this is something that, as you said, we've been hearing from the community, and we could actually perhaps make this better when it's advertised and we get more public feedback for that. Ms. Antwine.
I appreciate that, President Hummer. I would like to amend the motion that the actual reports start in January, in the first January meeting, but the yes or no vote to have those reports monthly be done today, please.
Okay. Ms. Shaw.
I second this.
Okay. Already seconded. Mr. Grannon.
Yeah, I think Ms. Schallheim is correct in seconding the newly amended motion, but I guess I would just say I'm not sure, especially as Ms. Antoine has revised it to call for these reports starting in January, I'm not sure how there could be any credible concern that the public would not want such information provided at each meeting, including, things like good news, like the statistics are even better in anti-bullying, or there's nothing to report on transportation because everything's working smoothly. If these are the issues that the constituents were most vocal and animated about, having specified items on at least every meeting to discuss, or at least once a month, I think would be completely in accord with the public's desires.
And as I said, I'm not opposed to these. I just think for transparency and to get community feedback that this is another one that would be better to be put out to the public so that people are aware and that they can contact us ahead of time before we take a vote on something like this. Because as I said, I believe this is something that could actually be expanded even to more to this, and then we can be more detailed rather than trying to set something today that, as people are just hearing about, give 2 weeks to hear from the community and for us to also formulate, because as I said, I think it's a good idea and I'd like to add things to it, but as I just heard about it, it's not time. I would like to have time so that it could be considered thoroughly in all areas. That's just what, it's not opposing your amendment, it's just wanting to have the time for that. Ms. Corkadell.
As a point of clarification, the newly amended motion, does that mean that if January was not realistic, for example, to cite an example for the administration to perform to, due to logistics, operational, and procedurals, and needed an extra month, does that mean that we would then be just voting for it to occur in January? Because I would prefer that we have a discussion about it through the agenda to determine what is the best month to start, whether it's tomorrow or 2 months from now. If I could get clarification on that.
Ms. Antoine.
So for clarification, I amended the motion. The original motion was to start the monthly reports in these areas. In consideration of what President Hummer shared and some of the other things that have come up since this motion was made, I recommended that the report start in January. I personally believe enough is out there right now for the heads of those departments to build the public's trust and as soon as possible start reporting for the positives, and then the concerns that will come in, they should have the time as we move this forward to address those as well.
Ms. Schalheim.
I just want to put on the record that I totally agree with everything that Ms. Antoine just said.
Mr. Gilliland.
Madam President, I'll defer.
Pardon the bit unusual of me coming up before called. Again, Darren Burns for the record. I just want to make sure the board stays on course from a Robert's Rules and your handbook. Remember that you have not yet voted on a motion to add this item. You're now starting to discuss the substance of it. Again, there's a range within which you would have to do that in order to understand what you're voting on. But I wanted to point out to you, as you currently do your agenda with respect to what the public anticipates, remember that action items encompasses several varieties of action items, depending on what type of thing. And so you have some flexibility in Ms. Antoine in your motion. You can ask for something to be added under the action item category as an action item, as an information item, and we sometimes see as I/A, information action. And that imparts a different meaning. And so I just want you to know that if your intent is to add the item, and that's the discussion for today for the first time, the best would be, from a record standpoint, as an information/action item, because you're bringing it forward for the first time if it's approved, and apparently going to try to discuss acting on it. So I just wanted to point out that those are ways you can be on an action item, but you were starting to stray into the substance, and you've not yet decided whether or not you're covering it and how you're covering it. So I would just suggest that try to take care of that point of order first.
Ms. Antoine, did that?
Okay, so I am introducing a motion for information/action, that this motion that I made earlier be added to the action items
As an information/item.
As an information/item, in order that we address these pressing issues and take a vote as to whether or not we have reports on it each month.
Okay. So, Mr. Grant.
I second and would like to call the vote on Ms. Antoine's motion.
All right. Ms. Connolly, would you call the vote, please?
Mr. Grannon.
Aye.
Ms. Corkadell.
Aye.
Ms. Urea.
Aye.
Ms.
Aye.
Ms. Antwine?
Aye.
Ms. Schallheim?
Aye.
Mr. Live?
Aye.
Ms. Ellis?
Aye.
Ms. Hummer?
Aye.
9-0, motion passes.
Are there any other items for established agenda order? Then the agenda stands as amended. Next is item 5.01. This is an item that was added to the agenda, board election of officers. So, Mr. Grannon.
As I noted earlier, the legislature and public have sent a powerful message about a new direction for the board. There's no reason to delay an opportunity for that message to be reflected in the board's officers. I nominate Terry Gilliland for president of the board to serve until the next regularly scheduled election. Having Mr. Gilliland serve as president would strike the right balance of responding to the public's call for change and having an experienced person preside over our meetings until an elected member of the board can take over as president. And Ms. Hummer can continue to provide her insights and experience as a regular voting member of the board.
Second.
So just for clarification, there is board policy that stands regarding election of officers. Policy 201.03 states that the board shall hold its annual meeting on or near as possible to the second Tuesday in July. At the annual meeting in July, the board shall elect a president and a vice president from among its members by individually recorded vote. The public and other board members may recall that we have discussed changing this policy based on the new elections coming up. It's now been discussed. Now makes the 5th time in the past about 4 or 5 months that this has been discussed in public session. It's been discussed during policy committee meeting, and twice. This now makes the 3rd time here at the board. The last time it was discussed here at the board, the policy committee, and the whole board determined that no changes would be made to this policy until the new elected board came on, so that the newly elected board could be the ones that would make the decisions about board leadership moving forward. It is currently on the agenda for, I believe, the January, or Ms. Ortiz, I'm sorry to call you out, but it's already on the agenda for the policy committee to consider revisions. It's already on the schedule. Am I correct in that?
Good afternoon. For the record, Jeanette Ortiz, Legislative and Policy Counsel. So, yes, what was discussed over several months, I actually had initially brought the policy to the policy committee to review, and my intention was that, let's get it started so that this newly elected, partially elected school board would be able to have it presented today on second reading and move forward with how you would like the policy amended. However, based on feedback from some board members, it was ultimately determined to just go ahead and wait until this board was seated and move forward with amending the policy then. And so, yes, I can absolutely, if the board would like me to bring it to the January Policy Committee meeting, I can absolutely do that.
Ms. Antwine.
Thank you. Just for clarification, I'm confused. Are we to discuss today the policy on voting in July, or is this a discussion about the actual change of leadership?
So the policy, actually, your policy, as currently written, says that board leadership is selected in July, and that's because in the past, a new member, when we had appointed school board, they were appointed to begin their term in July. Obviously, that's not the case anymore, in that elected school board members will now take office in December. And so these were the discussions that we had in policy committee and in this, in the front of the full board, with regards to, obviously that would need to change given the fact that new members would be taking office in December. However, there wasn't a 100% consensus amongst the board, and so it was determined to hold off on that. So I'm not sure, if the intention is to vote on school officers, on board officers, that would be in violation of your current policy, since it was ultimately decided to hold on and wait for this elected board to move forward. Now, if you want to, move to amend the current policy, there's a process for that in accordance with your policy setting, policy BF, in which it would go before the policy committee, the revisions would be made, and then it would have a first, second, and third reading, as with any other policy change.
So, Lotto, just.
No, I just want to, so thank you. Perfect clarification on Ms. Hummer's question. Ms. Antwine, it was, this agenda item was put on by Mr. Grant and then second by others and voted to, and so we don't have a presentation, staff, on what the next steps are. That will be dictated by this board. Just so that we're clear that Ms. Ortiz is not prepared to speak to. We were asked, and I'll use my terms, to sort of stand down. It was brought forward. Ms. Ortiz knew, looking at the crystal ball, that the policy no longer matched the reality because of an elected board. So she had brought it forward to the board policy committee to look for changes so that it would, the reality and the policy would coincide. During several conversations, as Ms. Hummer alluded to, prior to your arrival on the board, it was decided to put this policy on hold. She was asked to stand down as policy counsel until further notice. So we're ready to serve you, but the conversation today at the board table is based on you as a board. You put it on the agenda.
Understood. So there were plans to change the policy in January. That's what's being made clear.
It is. When an item comes before the policy committee, any item can be put on the policy committee at the request of board members, or sometimes the school system puts it on there and then we revise it, and it's discussed at policy. It's determined what changes can be made. Then it's brought back for this board, and the board then can also add things. There's board members that serve on the policy committee, so they would have the say in any revisions. Then it's come here where also changes could be made. It's presented. It has for first reading. Then it has a 30-day comment period where the community can weigh in. Then it has a second reading, a third reading, and we vote at the third reading. That's the structure. Mr. Grant.
Thank you for that.
As a point of clarification, my motion has been seconded, so we will be voting on that today. And just as a matter of reality, to whatever extent there's any inconsistency between, or a purported inconsistency between such a vote today, and my vote, again, has been seconded to nominate Mr. Gilliland to serve as president of the board. To whatever extent there is any purported daylight between that and this policy, obviously that's driven by the special circumstance that the legislature has never made this change before. And to be frank, the only person that would have legal standing to raise such a challenge to that would be Ms. Hummer, should she not be elected president of the board. So we're not going to face any lawsuits or anything like that unless Ms. Hummer were to file such a lawsuit.
So if I may, so I just have concerns, and maybe board counsel would want to weigh in. My concern is.
There's not a question. I've not posed a question. If you would like to pose a question, that's fine. I have not posed a question to the administration.
Okay.
I've made a motion that's been seconded.
And now it's open for discussion. Ms. Ortiz, do you have a point of clarification for us?
So just as your legislative and policy counsel, and in accordance with the fact that you're bound by your policies, just setting the precedent to be in violation of your own policies is concerning. So as legal advice, I would be concerned with that. Your board counsel may have something to add to that, but it just sets a precedent that if you make an exception today, then why won't we do it any other time with any other policy? So that, for me, legally is concerning.
Ellis.
Okay, so just so that I understand, this is a policy. This is not just I've read this in the handbook, so this exists elsewhere. Is that? Okay.
It is.
Policy BBC.
It is policy BBC, board organizational meeting, and board officers.
Okay, so is it not also possible to move to amend the policy now instead of dragging out the process? Because this election has been known about for a long time. There was, actually, I do have a question first before I go on with that. So when did you first bring this concern to the policy committee?
So we brought the policy because the policy committee doesn't meet in July and August. So it's brought in the September meeting. We brought it to the September board meeting. Mr. Grannon actually had concerns with us moving forward on the policy and did not want us to move forward until this board was seated.
That was September of this year.
September of this year. And so then the policy committee, based on Mr. Grannon's concerns, took the policy back to policy committee, I believe in October, I forget which meeting, to discuss whether or not, we should go ahead and move forward just to set it up for this school board. So you would have had it today on second reading. But after, based on Mr. Grannon's concerns that were raised, there wasn't consensus on the board, the policy committee determined just to go ahead and hold off and wait to move forward with any revisions until this board was seated.
Okay.
And so that's why it's not before you on second.
But
reading.
we've known about the election since nearly a year before the concern was brought to the policy committee. So I mean, I agree with Mr. Grannon that a statement has been made by the voters. So can we not move to amend the policy now, as opposed to slowing down the process by taking it to committee and then bringing it before for public comment? We could move to amend the policy now, put it out today for public comment, and have the election.
So we have a process based on policy BF, and the process is that it goes to, I typically bring my suggested revisions to the policy committee, and based upon, what's determined at the policy committee goes before you on first reading. It goes online for a 30-day public comment period. Then it comes back for second reading, and then it comes back for a third reading. So not only would be in opposition, violation of your BBC policy of organization of the board, it'll also be in violation of policy BF, which is policy making process.
I just think the voters are not being heard. It seems like there's a resistance to that change. Again, this election was known about a year prior to it even being brought to the policy committee, and I think that's unfortunate.
Mr. Live.
Yes. I would support Mr. Grannon's motion, at least the process to move forward and allow this board, which is a completely different board, to make a decision regarding leadership. I believe that's the right thing to do. But I also believe that the Board of Education has policy that's published throughout the community, and that businesses, contractors, citizens, staff look to see how we do business. And we do business by a process that is set in policy, a policy that we should follow as we execute our business. And if we take the opportunity to, circumvent that policy for decision A, someone in the future will come back and say, well, look what you did for decision A. I want you to circumvent that policy for decision B. So I believe that sets us up, and perhaps it's all theoretical, and this is all can be done, as Mr. Grannon says. However, I believe it puts us in an arena that we don't want to be, where our citizens say, well, this is how it's supposed to be done. For example, the redistricting committee that's going to report to us and during this time. If during the process of their deliberations, something has changed without going through the process, that completely changes the ground rules. So that's just my own personal concern. Do I think this board, as currently constituted, should, as soon as possible, vote on leadership? Yes. Do I think we should violate our policy to do that? No. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Ortiz, there is a policy committee meeting next week on the 12th?
Yes, correct.
So why couldn't we get that into that right now on December 12th and move forward in accordance with our policy as expeditiously as that policy allows? That's my observation.
Ms. Antoine.
Is what I was planning to follow up with. If it's about the policy changes, I heard that the contingency was to get the new board seated. And so we wouldn't necessarily be violating the current policy because of that contingency. No. However, with that said, I'm with you. I believe it is better that we sit down with you on the 12th to better understand how to move forward before we make that kind of decision, with the contingency that by the 19th, we bring this back up.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the policy doesn't have a contingency in it. The policy is the policy, but the discussion amongst the board was just to hold off until this new board took office to determine how you wanted to move forward. So I'm getting that today. And typically with the policies, I will have worked on them for a while and would be sending out tomorrow to the policy committee proposed revision. So I'm happy to bring the policy to the December 12th meeting, but typically we're not doing these sort of things with less than 24 hours notice for me to prepare
right.
the
So
information.
I hear you. I understand. There was a contingency to hold off on changing the policy
Yes, correct.
until we were seated. We also, though, just motioned and seconded. So now we're violating something either way. So my recommendation is to support sitting with you to better understand how to move forward, but to be fair to those who put us here, we need to do this up front and early.
Mr. Rea.
Sorry. I concur with everything Mr. Leib said. I think as a newly elected board or partial elected, we need to be very careful in what we do at the beginning, because we do not want to start off by violating a very important policy that has been established, because that not only sets a very bad precedent for the future, but it puts off a bad message that our newly elected board does not concur with any policy, as Mr. Leib said. And I think it's important that it is brought up to the policy committee next week. So that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Ms. Corkadell.
I just want to clarify to my other board members who just spoke, are we proposing an amendment to Mr. Grannon's motion, or are we suggesting an entirely new motion that would need to be discussed after this one?
I'm sorry. I think there's still maybe a little more discussion before that can be answered.
Right.
'Cause
I think they would be two separate motions. That's part of the discussion. Ms. Schallheim.
I agree that this needs to come before the policy committee immediately, and that we really need to understand. It is unfortunate. I do echo Ms. Ellis's concerns. I mean, it's not as if one day we woke up and said, "Oh my gosh, there's a new elected board." No, we filed a run a year ago, just shy of a year ago, and so the fact that this has been put off this long is troubling to me. I also signed up to be on the policy committee too, so I would love to see where this goes, and I want to see this rectified immediately. So,
Mr. Grannon.
Thank you. I've got 3 brief points. First is just, I think for completeness, to characterize my statements about board elections at our prior meetings. I expressly moved that the new board be allowed to choose its new leaders as soon as possible. I mentioned December as an option. That was said December was too early. Then I mentioned January as an option. Then it was said January was too early. And to be frank, Ms. Hummer opposed that and made points about why newly elected members were not appropriate to serve as board leaders immediately. That's my first point. My second point is I take quite seriously my responsibility and my oath to serve as a board member, and as well, frankly, as an officer of the court and someone who's worked my entire life as an attorney, including as a prosecutor. I would not lightly suggest that we deviate from any published policy if I thought it were seriously going to suggest a precedent or suggest to the public that we would simply circumvent or not follow our policies whenever we wanted to. This is not the type of policy that will ever apply again. This is a specific moment in history when the legislature has spoken about the Constitution and this board. There was lots of wrangling done to push this to the side, And we're going to have an up or down roll call vote on my motion to do this. And if the newly elected members, to me, I think that's striking to me, the newly elected members vote no on their opportunity to change the leadership of this board, I don't know what you're saying to your constituents when you do that. And third, not to be sort of Pollyanna or dorky about this, but when our founders got together and at the Constitutional Convention and recognized that the Articles of Confederation were not working to run this country properly, you know what they said? There go the Articles. And today we have the Constitution, thanks to their bravery and thanks to their ingenuity in doing that. There was not one document that gave them the ability to throw out the Articles of Confederation. Instead, it was ratified later by the states, and that took 2 years to do that. If we take this vote now, the vote's happening, but if this vote passes now and the leadership of this board changes, the only person on the planet who will have legal standing to challenge that is Ms. Hummer if she does not win the election for president. I will say, in addition to that, we can easily change this policy going forward. And by the way, note what I said about my nomination of Mr. Gilliland. I'm not talking about in perpetuity. I said, I nominate Terry Gilliland for president of the board to serve until the next regularly scheduled election. We can then go to the policy committee and do a first, second, third, 15th reading, if you all want, and decide when that next election should be. Should it be in January? Should it be in December? Should it be in July, as it has been previously?
Before we ask any more, I would ask Mr. Burns to come up and give us some counsel on this area.
Good afternoon, Darren Burns, Board Counsel. I'm glad you asked me up, President Hummer, because I was concerned in that something may have been overlooked. I was present for the conversation that ended up resulting in the tabling of the discussion of officers change, and I believe there was a pretty good consensus that it would simply be started after the new board was set. So I think everybody's recollection on that point was correct. The problem with moving to do something contrary to your current published policy does not stop at the convenience factor and the fact that you have a newly elected contingent on the board. There's actually state law that requires you to adopt and apply consistently policies, bylaws, procedures. It's state law 4-108 of the education article. That breathes the life into the process that Ms. Ortiz gets to spend so much time in shepherding the committee through its steps. Over time, you have developed a much more intricate policy and regulation, but that's a separate issue, policy setting policy that the public expects. They are allowed to come to meetings. They are allowed to see policy being made in all its glory. They are here for the multiple readings. They are here for the multiple amendments. That is in your policy. But beyond that, you have in that same policy today, as it was before this board was seated today, as it was 3 months ago, and will be in January or December, you have a provision in the policy setting policy, and I always hate to say it, but that's what it's called, policy setting policy. BF, okay, that says if you want to suspend your procedures for making policy, it requires unanimous vote of the board. And so before you take a vote because it feels expedient, and Mr. Live made some good points. I mean, from an attorney's perspective, I appreciate them. I only care about whether the board makes a misstep today by simply not being aware, perhaps because of some folks being new, that there is a policy provision that allows you to suspend your policy setting policy. It's by unanimous vote. Absent that, Ms. Ortiz has already outlined for you, and you know that as soon as you can get on a policy committee meeting, you could address this topic. But I just want to make sure you're aware of that.
Ms. Ellis.
Okay, so if I'm hearing correctly, we have 3 potential motions to put forth here. One is to hold the election. 1 would be to suspend our policy making.
That
policy
motion has
setting
not,
policy.
As a point of order, that's a potential thing, but as Mr. Grannon has pointed out, the current pending motion that has been seconded and being discussed is to actually do that which I was advising you could violate your policy.
Okay, so in other words, it doesn't require a separate motion to do that. If we hold this vote, it has to be unanimous.
That's correct.
And we are.
Now, this vote that Mr. Grant's posed is a vote, which I would deem in any other circumstance to be a majority vote carrying who would be an officer under his proposed action. What I'm advising you, and the reason it was important to come up, is that action of voting on that and then considering it your formal approved action is in itself would be a violation of that policy, because you wouldn't. This is of course I'm only giving an opinion. I'm not. You know, you are the ones who have offered to serve. I'm serving you. I'm offering you my legal opinion that you have a policy that requires an affirmative action if you want to go outside your policy setting procedure, because 4-108 requires you to follow a uniform set of policies.
Ms. Antoine.
Thank you for that clarification. I have a question for Mr. Grannon. Based on the premise that the voters have made a decision, I wanted to better understand your rationale behind just switching out president with vice president who was pre-existing before the elections.
Thank you for that question. My thinking there is that, as I noted, I think that Mr. Gilliland would strike the right balance of demonstrating our responsiveness to the legislature's and the public's call for change, and also provide an opportunity, because the second thing I'm going to do after this, whatever happens on this, is suggest that we table until the December 19th meeting the election of the vice president. Because to me, if we have a president who's not one of the elected members, in my view, I'm just one voter, but in my view, it's all the more important that the vice president be one of the newly elected members. And I think it would be best for you all to have a little bit of time to consider your willingness and desire to serve in that position. So that's what I intend to do. That's what I intend to do after this. Obviously, if you all disagree with the idea that Mr. Gilliland should be president, then you can vote against that, and then you could always nominate somebody else to be president. But we're going to have a vote on that.
Ms. Corkadell.
If I may, Mr. Burns, have a clarification here. So there is a procedure that we could enact today and now, but it would have to preclude and require a tabling of the existing motion that would allow the body, if they were inclined, to set aside the policy in the interest of the information being provided, and then re-propose today, right behind it, redirect Mr. Grannon's motion?
Yes, and there's different formats by which Mr. Grannon could either table or withdraw his motion or anything else. But just so we're right on point with what your policy says, and this is policy BF, so that you know exactly what you would have to do. It says the time limits for introduction, discussion, and action may be waived, this is with respect to policy, may be waived, 1, by unanimous vote of all board members at any regular or special meeting, or 2, by an affirmative vote of 5 or more members at any regular or special meeting following no less than 30 days of public notice, which kind of gets back to your multiple readings and all that standard process. So yes, today, if the pending motion were defeated, tabled, etc., you could still then have a vote as a body whether or not to suspend your policy setting procedures.
Ms. Ellis.
So even if we have a vote today, we should have another motion to add. Do we need a motion to add this to the policy committee for? No, okay.
No,
I wasn't
it does
clear on
not.
that. Okay.
No, this can be, this is referred right now. It's already been asked. It's
it's
added
already
to it's already on the list. It's added for next week. So that would already be right on the table, right?
Because even if we chose to have an election today, we still have to address when the actual elections going forward will occur, right? So
Because you would still have that policy on the books.
Correct.
That's
Right.
Mr. Grannon.
I call for a vote on the motion that's been seconded.
Well, I still haven't made my comments on this. I just want to say again, I believe that Mr. Grannon is mischaracterizing the discussions that we had regarding this policy. It did come up. There was extensive. People can go back and watch the meetings about this. And when it was decided, we had initially proposed that we would have first reading, and that here today at this first meeting, there would be second reading of the policy, and then on the 19th there would be third reading and passed. And at that time, any changes that this board had done, the elections, could have be made at that point, based on large part on Mr. Grannon's discussion about that this should be decided by the elected board. It was decided to postpone that so that the elected board had the full say from the beginning and how the new policy would be shaped. The previous board had made some proposals that they could come, and then this board could have amended if they wanted to, if they disagreed. But based on those discussions, it was made that let this board have the say from the very beginning, that they were the ones to formulate. And when it was proposed and was brought up at the meeting to wait and have the new board, Mr. Grannon did not object to that at that time. So this was not a hidden thing that was in there to have. I fully believe that we need to make these changes going forward. I share Mr. Lives, Mr. Burns, everyone's concerns about us waiving policy on any issue. It's not about me personally. It is the integrity of policies going forward. Our policies, we lose standing. Even if you think that this policy has nothing to do with any of our others, we lose standing on all of our policies moving forward if we are not following them there. When we have the mechanism in place to move this along quickly, as this policy says, and if we can waive the timelines of the three readings by an affirmative vote of 5 or more members at any regular special meeting following no less than 30 days of public notice. So this policy could come before, I believe this is correct, could come to the policy meeting next week on the 12th. The policy committee can make changes, and we could put it out for 30 days comments, and we could waive the second and third reading, correct, and have a vote then. Am I reading that correctly, Ms. Ortiz?
Right. So, yes.
So it could be a shortened process to have that in there based on the current policies that we have. But the whole basis of this and why this was delayed, and yes, I know we had known for a long time, but the whole basis why it was delayed was because there was a strong feeling that the newly elected board members should be the ones making the decisions. We didn't want to make a say. So, for instance, would you have the old board say elections will be held in December, that the new board may want to say January, or vice versa, or to have that we wanted whatever the transition would be to the new members for the new board to have in there. And as I said, that was discussed very openly here, and Mr. Grannon did not object to us postponing this policy until the new board came in, so that they would be the ones from start to finish that made the decisions on this policy. So, but it could go to policy next week, be done, put out for put on the 19th agenda, 30 days, and we could waive second and third reading, and it could be voted on at that time. Mr. Grannon.
I guess I just want to say that anyone who was at that meeting and came away with the view that I was of the opinion that the newly elected board should not be able to determine its leaders as soon as possible, I don't know how anyone could hold that view. I also don't know how anyone could hold the view that the comments that you expressed at the meeting gave anything other than resistance to the idea of the newly elected board determining its membership as soon as possible. So we're going to vote on this motion today. And I do want to say, after the result of the motion, so for example, my motion is to nominate Mr. Gilliland to serve as president. If that motion were to pass by 5 votes and pass, we could easily then, all 8 of us right here, vote unanimously to suspend the very policy according to our own procedures, and there would be no problem. You would be the only one who would have cause to vote against that. The other thing that we could do is you could moot all of this right now and just voluntarily step down as president and let the new board elect the president. So I do not think it is at all genuine to say that what you are saying is somehow to help facilitate the will of the people. If you were to voluntarily step down right now, this board could elect the new president and move this entire discussion.
I will just say, because I believe this has now gotten a little personal, I'm not certain what the motivation is behind to remove me. My purpose has always been to keep this board functioning as well as possible. There's no hidden agenda for me. I was the one who brought the policy forward and wanted to move it forward. Your perception may be that I was resistant. I was the one who brought the policy forward to get this changed so that this board could vote on it have its second reading right now to vote on it. And you can go back and look on the agenda. You did not speak against that when we said we're going to table it because there was so much discussion. I did share, and I will share this going forward, that I think whoever comes in to this position, me or anyone else, it is to the benefit of this board, for the leadership, for someone that knows how things run. The main role that I serve is to keep things running. It doesn't have to be me, but I think that's a benefit to this board and any board moving forward. And so I said that looking at what's best for the board, not for myself. No one else on this board has served as president of this body, and I will tell you, it's not a power grab. It's a lot of work. It is easily twice as much work as a regular board member of different things, of planning things. It is, it's not. I don't think that new members will understand everything that comes on there. I will be, if this vote goes against, I will be more than happy and willing to work with them to do that. But I think this mischaracterization that I am, for some reason, trying to hold on to this for my personal view and my personal power is frankly insulting. And given the amount of time and dedication I've given to this school system and what I've done, that you would characterize me in such a way I find personally offensive. Ms. Antwine.
So I share that concern. This was brought up in order to accommodate what the people have said. It was not, is my understanding, it was not to be put out there as a personal strike against anyone, but against, rather than have us come on as the new board and not address what the people have requested that we do. And I don't want the tangent to become personal because that will affect my vote. I do think, though, that we should, in this moment, vote. I think that it's important that we understand how to move forward through policy, but I believe a vote is necessary at this time. I do not agree with switching out existing officers with another existing officer if your intent is to address what the people have said to do. But let's not make this personal. We have stood up and said we will be unified. Let's continue to be unified.
Ms. Ellis.
I was present at the meeting, the last meeting where this was discussed, and to be fair, I don't have the minutes in front of me, but it was very clear that Mr. Grannon was fighting for the voice of the voters in that meeting, and that he did not agree to put off the process and prolong it. I feel it's being presented here today that the decision that was made was as a courtesy to the newly elected board, and I don't see how it's. I don't see how. I don't think any newly elected member would have been opposed to having the opportunity to choose their leader today. So I don't see how that was doing the elected members a favor or a courtesy. I believe it appeared to be a resistance to the change.
Ms. Schalheim.
It's very strange. We're in very unusual circumstances here because this is the only situation that I can think of where in two different elections, then you're now serving with your former opponent. So I think we have to take that into consideration. But I also wanted to say that I concur with what Ms. Antwine and what Ms. Alice has said about this matter as well. So, because I was also at the meeting too. Thanks.
Mr. Grannon.
Just so it's not lost on anyone, I said at the outset of my comments in making the motion, and Ms. Hummer can continue to provide her insights and experience as a regular voting member of the board, and I continue to share that, or I continue to hold that view. For a vote on the motion.
I'm going to weigh in if I can.
Yes.
This is a board decision, clearly, but I am in this capacity as an advisor to the board. Mr. Grandin, you said that you wanted to have, what your suggestion was to vote on your motion, and then, if passed, then to vote on suspending the rules of the policy. Those will be your choices. I'm going to advise you, as your counsel has advised you, and as policy counsel has advised you, that at the very least, you're going to need to reverse that order. If you vote first, you are now, and that goes through, you are violating your own policy. If you choose to suspend the policy, then I think you're going to have to go through the work of a proposal to do that, to put that before the board, and then go back to a vote. But I would not do the prior first. That is simply my advice to this board.
Ms. Corkadell.
I'll just say that if Mr. Grannon is inclined, that I would be willing to state an alternative motion to present us in a better light to address some of the concerns or move forward. But I will defer.
Ms. Ellis.
So I believe that's what I mentioned much earlier. Maybe my questions were misunderstood, but so there is a motion on the table. Are we able to table that motion and vote to suspend the policy and then hold our...
I would ask policy counsel to advise you on Robert's rules.
Yes, so.
That would be, yes.
Oh, board,
that would be
board counsel.
I'm sorry. I said board, I apologize. I meant board counsel. Thank you for the correction.
Without belaboring, again, Darren Burns, board counsel, without belaboring the nuances in all the Roberts rules provisions on motions, keep in mind, you have a proponent of a motion, and I think Mr. Grannon's remind you of that. He is a proponent of a motion that was seconded. There is discussion, and he has called the question. Unless he's willing to table the motion or withdraw his motion for in a little more of a vernacular, at some point the board has to address his motion. I mean, you can't, if people could sort of vote down his motion after seconded, people's motions would never get through. So at some point you have to first, in a parliamentary fashion, address the pending motion if the proponent is not withdrawing it.
Mr. Grannon.
Yeah, I'm not going to withdraw it. With all due respect to Dr. Arlotto, thank you for that opinion. It is his view, certainly. It's just a view. It's not a certainty. And I frankly offered this suggestion of a motion for suspension after the fact because, as was described by legal counsel, that will require a unanimous vote, which is not the threshold that's required for passing the motion that I've made. And frankly, it was also done to give an opportunity to Ms. Hummer or anyone else to say, okay, we're done. The board has voted. They voted on who the new president should be. We want this issue to be over. There's not going to be any legal challenges after the fact. And as a result, the board is now unanimously voting to suspend this policy, and let's move on. Let's have a fresh start. And none of this is personal whatsoever. And it's still not lost on me that in terms of saying that this is not about resistance, if there is a sense in any body, in a parliament, if there's a sense that the majority of the members of the parliament want to change who the leadership is, it's quite appropriate for that leader to step down, stand election amongst the new members, and make any arguments you want about your experience and your ability to lead the organization. And if you can command the majority of the body, you will win the election. If you don't, then you won't, and somebody else will hold it. The other thing I'm going to say is this idea that it's so critical that one person be president. On the county council, for example, the county council members rotate the chairmanship of the county council once each year. There's not one person who gets in as president. And I think, the county is just about as difficult to run as the school system. So this idea that only one person should hold a position for several years is not something that is followed by the other elected bodies in the county. So I'm making the motion. I'm calling for a vote on the motion. Let's see what happens on the motion, and then we can take whatever steps are necessary after that.
Just a clarification, the board elections are held every year, and so there's not a continuing person. It's up to the board at the time as who they vote in. So it's not a given that one person will serve multiple years. That is held to a vote every time. So the question has been called. As to placing Mr. Gilliland in as president. I do think that the question was not asked if Mr. Gilliland is willing to serve as president, and so I think he needs to weigh in on that before a vote would be held.
I'm going to call a point of order in that. There is absolutely no such requirement. That, if he's nominated and it's voted and he decides that he's not willing to take the position, that's an entirely different story. But to pressure him before the fact to say something like that, there's absolutely no legal requirement that happen. That's just your opinion.
You're right. It is my opinion, and I would think somebody would want to be asked if they wanted to take on a position of leadership before they were voted in. But that will be up to Mr. Gilliland if he wants to speak. Ms. Ellis.
I think I'm concluding my comments, but in light of taking everything in totality and having been present in that meeting when it was discussed by this board, again, it's been presented as if it was a courtesy to this elected board, but it appeared to be more of a resistance to this board having the opportunity to elect their leaders. So in that spirit, I'm gonna agree with Mr. Grannon's motion that we hold this vote.
And again, I'll repeat that may have been and actually it would probably be to the benefit of the members who weren't present at those meetings to watch the meetings and see. The perceptions may be different if people were to watch the actual debate that occurred over the course of 2 meetings that came with this. People may come with different perspectives. But this time we will call the vote. Ms. Connolly, would you call the vote? The vote is, if you would repeat your motion, Mr. Grannon.
My motion was to nominate Terry Gilliland for president of the board to serve until the next regularly scheduled election.
Okay. Ms. Connolly, if you call the roll.
Mr. Grannon?
Aye.
Ms. Corkadell?
Nay.
Ms. Urea is absent. Mr. Gilliland?
It involves me. I will abstain.
What was that? Ms. Antwine?
I say nay because it does not serve the purpose of the intent presented.
Ms. Schulheim?
This is a difficult thing. And I only say aye because it's the will of the voters.
Mr. Leib?
Nay.
Ms. Ellis?
Aye.
Ms. Hummer?
Nay. What's the final vote, Ms. Connolly?
And the final vote is 2 in the positive, 5 in the negative, 1 abstention,
No.
1 not present.
No.
Motion passes.
No.
Motion fails.
Okay, state the votes again, please, Ms. Connolly.
The aye is Mr. Grannon. Ms. No. Ms. Urea is absent. Mr. Gilliland abstained. Ms. Antwine.
Yes. No.
Sorry about that. That makes it.
No, it's not a tie. You
it's-
even abstain.
It's
An abstain doesn't create
It's
a
kind of,
tie.
and any motion must pass with 5 votes.
So it's 2-4-1.
3-4-1.
I'm sorry, 3-4-1.
3-4-1. So the motion fails. Ms. Corkadell.
I would like to propose a new motion while we are still on the topic of chair. I think in light of the conversation and the advisement, I would like to present our members with an alternative proposal. Number one, and that proposal would be to vote that on the desire of the board to elect a new leadership and to expedite the policy correction that would be necessary in order to do that, and to do that with extreme, all that necessary haste on behalf of the staff. I believe I heard some concerns about the making sure that it is done in a timely manner and the concerns of the optic of that. And so I would like to include that as part of the caveat of the motion.
So your motion would be, as based on policy BF, section 2H, it says, by an affirmative, timelines for introduction, discussion, and action may be waived by an affirmative vote of 5 or more members at any regular special meeting following no less than 30 days public notice. So that would be, as we discussed earlier, it could come to policy next week. It could be presented at the December 19th meeting. It could be voted, put out for 30 days comment. It could be voted on there, and the other situations could be waived. Is that your motion, to follow that policy and doing that as quickly? The other option is that there could be, the other option for changing policy in that most expeditious way would be, we could have another vote now, and a unanimous vote of the board could suspend the policy as of today and change it. So I'm just wanting clarification for which route would you want to propose?
The 30-day notification of public.
Okay. So that's an official motion?
Yes, ma'am.
Do I have a second? Okay. Mr. Grant.
I'd like to offer a friendly amendment to Ms. Corkadell's motion, that since this thing that we're running into, again, is never going to occur again. We're never going to be in this moment of time with this overlapping mixture of the board that's a result of the change that the legislature made. The legislature did the best that it could to try to deal with staggered terms, but obviously it was not sitting with our board handbook and policy and all of that kind of thing. So my friendly amendment is that the board take a vote now, and I'm moving that the board take a vote now, that the sense of the board is not binding, but that the sense of the board is that the current officers should voluntarily step down, and therefore there will not be any issue about waiting for 30 days, and then this board can vote right now on the new officers if they voluntarily step down.
Ms. Corkadell, are you open to adding that amendment to your proposal?
I will be candid. I'm not familiar with that type of emotion of a sense of something. Is this is this in a category of a resolution versus I'm a little confused, sir.
It would be in the very same way that the board has taken votes previously on matters like magnetic rails and other things that the board does not control, but the board nevertheless wanted to express an opinion on. And if the objection to my motion earlier was that it was not in accord with policy. That motion has been defeated, and I accept that. I'm moving on, and what I'm saying is if those positions are not occupied by individuals, they obviously can be filled immediately. And what I'm suggesting, or I'm moving, is that the board take a vote on the sense of the board as to whether the current officers should voluntarily step down. Now, if they choose not to do that after the board expresses its voice, that's their decision. But that's my motion.
So then that sounds like a separate motion from mine as opposed to an amendment. Are you requesting that I table my motion till your next one has been seconded and debated?
If that makes more sense to you, I'm happy to do that in deference to you. Yes.
I will rescind my motion in the interest of the other conversation first then. But I do intend to make it if, depending on the outcome.
And just as a point of clarification, what I've said is not at all inconsistent with expediting the actual policy change that will take place after that. And again, my motion is for, and it needs to be seconded, for a vote, for the board to hold a vote right now on the sense of the board as to whether the current officers should voluntarily vacate these positions so that they can be filled.
Ms. Ellis.
I just have a quick question for when we take this to policy as far as moving forward. So we take this to the policy committee, potentially indicating that we want to hold our elections in December. But going through that channel, we won't actually be able to hold our election until January. So would we have to address that separately in the policy to be able to hold that election in January?
That's a great question. Yes, we can do a special section. For example, we have some board policies that because of a partially elected school board, some of it was consistent, some of up until December 3rd, and some of it had to change after December 3rd. We kind of revised it up until December 3rd and then changed it afterwards. So I can certainly draft some language in there that, however, in the, in 2019, they will
So
be
it can
held.
all be addressed
Sure,
within the
absolutely.
same policy.
Yes,
and
correct.
That's just a question that I've had, but it's not to detract from the discussion that's currently going on, and I concur with what Mr. Grannon is proposing.
Is that a second?
That's a second.
Mr. Gilliland.
Thank you, Madam President. I know this could go on a little bit. Mr. Grannon, if you would be accepting to this, and again, this might break a little bit of procedural protocol here. My concern, and forgive me, everyone, but we've had a group from Crofton that's been waiting here since 10 a.m. Or before, and if we can proceed through the rest, and then maybe get into this at the very end, if the board would be willing.
I'm fine with that. The only thing I would say is if this motion could be voted on within the next 2 minutes, I'd like to have that happen, because there's been enough discussion back and forth. People have made up their minds on whether, when and how the board should choose its officers. So I don't know that it really needs to be debated beyond that. We can get a sense of the board right now where the majority is. So I would like to call for a vote on the motion to be held in the next 2 minutes.
Okay, so the motion on the floor is to vote for, I suppose it's a resolution that the board would like the current leadership to step down and new elections to take place. So that is not binding to the current leadership, but it's to a sense of the board if that is what the board feels. Am I correct in stating that?
That's correctly stated.
Ms. Antwine.
Sorry, Crofton, but I got to vote in a second. So you want us to Mr. Grannon, I'm sorry. You want us to vote for the current board executives to voluntarily step down. That's
Yes, ma'am.
gotcha.
All right, Miss Connolly, please call the roll.
Mr. Brannan?
Aye.
Ms. Corkadell?
Well, regardless of my vote, I will still be placing the next motion in. So I will say aye to provide our chair and vice chair the opportunity to put closure.
Mr. Gilliland?
I'll still abstain.
Abstain. Ms. Antwine?
I see that as bullying, so it's a no for me.
No. Ms. Schulheim?
Aye.
Mr. Live?
Nay.
Ms. Alice?
Aye.
Ms. Hummer?
Nay.
So that's 4 in the positive, 3 in the negative, 1 abstention, 1 absent.
So the motion fails. Ms. Corkadell, would you like to?
That's not accurate.
Oh.
That's not accurate.
It's,
Can I have a roll call of who were the ayes? I counted 4 ayes.
she said that.
Right. This is not a motion. This is for a sense of the board. So the majority of the board was 4 of the current board. It's 4-3-1. The majority of the board, the majority sense of the board, the majority of the voting members of the board believe that the officer should step down.
It was a motion. All motions before this board based on legislation require a vote of 5 votes in the affirmative for any motion to pass that is in the legislation for this board. So it's not a majority. It always requires a 5 vote. So, Ms. Corkadell.
Okay. I'm going to put forth a motion based on our discussion in the interest of fairness and to avoid things like bullying and to place our fellow members a continuum of this presentation. My motion is that we vote on to elect a new board leadership and to present it through the expedited policy procedures that were previously discussed in my prior motion before I tabled it, so that we can engage in and restore some healthy conversation, as well as meeting the needs in a timely manner of all of our residents, since we are not able to come to enough votes today.
Is there a second for Ms. Corkadell's motion?
I second that.
Okay. Ms. Ellis?
2 things. I just want to concur with Mr. Grannon's assessment. We weren't voting for an action to occur. We were notifying of the will of the board. And so whatever you can call it a pass or a fail, but it is now known that a majority voted in favor of that. But I'm sorry, Ms. Corkadell, I didn't fully understand your motion. Can you clarify a little bit? Sorry.
My motion is that we agree as a body to immediately expedite the voting of our leadership in accordance with the policy expedition and exemption, that by providing 30-day public notice, which would be effective immediately upon conclusion of the policy committee. No.
At the first meeting.
At the first meeting.
December 19th, 30 days.
Okay, 30 days therein, that we take with haste, and that the administrators follow our haste to ensure that in January we will be able to finalize our vote based on some of.
Am I correct? We've already set that in motion, correct? We've already instructed that this will come to our policy committee.
Correct,
It's
but
already-
but the expedition to bypass the standard, which would be all those other multiple reads and
Right.
carry into the spring, would need that, and that is why I'm proposing this motion that we are basically taking a half of a step away from the policy, not a full step, so that we can expedite this process and make sure that the will of the people are being adhered to, and that we can move along.
So you're
as quickly
suggesting
as
that
possible.
on the front end, we go ahead and choose to suspend the full.
Yes, we want to suspend the existing
Right. Got it.
policy in order and invoke that the alternative policy to allow us to do this as quickly as possible and still meet our transparency obligations to our residents of the 30 days, which is where my biggest concern was, understanding that policy is always the people's policy.
I second Ms. Corkadell's motion with the point of information that by doing it within the policy that allows for only 30-day notice with a majority vote, we're actually acting completely within the policy and we're not stepping away from it at all.
Thank you. Sure about that.
I'd like to call the question.
Ms. Connolly, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Grannon?
Aye.
Aye. Oh, sorry.
Say my name yet.
Mr. Gilliland? Until it's 3 o'clock. Ms. Antoine?
Aye.
Ms. Shawhan?
Aye.
Mr. Lyde?
Aye.
Ms. Ellis?
Aye.
Ms. Hummer?
Aye.
8-0, motion passes.